if you walk into a high school biology classroom or a doctor's office or even just like a cheesy haunted house, there's almost always that one prop sitting in the corner.
Oh, yeah. The anatomical skeleton on the squeaky metal stand.
Right. And it just hangs there,
Yeah.
rigid, dry, basically functioning as a creepy coat rack. I mean, we're taught from a very young age, mostly just by default, that our bones are these dead scaffolding things.
Yeah, just these inert, solid sticks, right? And all the interesting living parts of you just happen to hang on them.
Exactly. But when you actually dive into the anatomical research and, the medical history we're looking at today, that illusion just completely shatters.
It really does. It's an incredibly pervasive mental image, though. People tend to view the skeleton as this static framework, sort of like the steel girders of a skyscraper.
Right, just holding up the meat. But welcome to our deep dive where we are going to challenge that. Today, we're looking right at you, literally, at the foundational core of your body. We are exploring the literal center of the human form. So that's the skull, the spine, and the ribs.
Right, and collectively, those structures make up what anatomists call the body's central axis, or the axial skeleton.
And our mission for this deep dive is to completely rewrite that mental image of the static coat rack you have in your head. Because this isn't just a frame, it's an active dynamic system.
Oh, absolutely. It's this complex evolutionary engineering marvel that actively keeps you breathing, and it's constantly reacting to the invisible force of gravity around you.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What exactly makes up this central axis?
Well, to understand the axis, you kind of have to look at the overall architectural plan of the human body. So an adult human typically has 206 bones in total.
Right.
And the axial skeleton, that central core we're focusing on, accounts for exactly 80 of those bones.
80 bones, okay.
Yeah, and the remaining 126 bones belong to a completely different functional category, which is called the appendicular skeleton.
Right. And the way I like to picture this division, just to make it easier, is to think about a car.
Sure.
So the axial skeleton, those 80 core bones, acts as the chassis.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Thanks. Yeah, it's the essential non-negotiable central axis of the vehicle. You literally have to have it for the car to exist as a functional unit.
Right, you can't have a car without a chassis.
Exactly. And the other 126 bones,
Hmm.
the appendicular skeleton, those are your wheels, your doors, like the external add-ons.
Which in human terms would be our arms and legs.
Yeah, arms, legs, and the pelvic and pectoral girdles, so, the hips and shoulders that essentially bolt those limbs onto the mainframe.
And that car analogy works perfectly, especially when you realize that this classification isn't just some arbitrary filing system. Modern anatomists didn't just invent it to make textbooks easier to read.
Right, it's not just a human convention.
No, not at all. It represents this really profound, ancient evolutionary blueprint. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, you had these pioneering comparative anatomists, people like Georges Cuvier and Richard Owen,
Okay.
and they started noticing this universal pattern. They laid out the bones of humans, bats, whales, birds, and they realized that this exact same foundational architecture exists across virtually all vertebrates.
So, meaning that the distinction between the central core and the limbs is literally baked into our DNA from millions of years ago.
Precisely. The central axis is so fundamental to vertebrate life that even a limbless creature, like, say, a snake, has a fully formed, incredibly complex axial skeleton.
Oh, wow. I never really thought about a snake having an axial skeleton, but obviously it does.
Yeah. Evolutionarily speaking, the central axis is the primary, indispensable structure. The limbs are just, secondary appendages that were built off of it much later.
Which makes it completely wild to realize how long it actually took for humanity to properly map out our own chassis. I mean, for centuries, the medical understanding of the human axial skeleton was fundamentally flawed.
The historical record on this is staggering. I mean, for over a millennium, anatomical education was based on these immense structural errors.
And that was mostly because of the ancient physician Galen, if I remember the source material correctly.
Yes, Galen. He essentially wrote the foundational medical texts that everyone relied on for hundreds of years. But he wasn't actually dissecting humans, right?
No, he wasn't. He was extrapolating his data by dissecting animals, specifically Barbary macaques, which are, a type of monkey.
And he just assumed the human skeleton was an identical one-to-one match with a macaque.
Pretty much. He projected animal anatomy right onto the human form.
Huh.
And because his authority was just considered absolute, nobody seriously challenged those texts.
Until, what, the 1500s?
Exactly. It wasn't until Andreas Vesalius came along in 1543 and began performing modern, rigorous human dissections that we finally started correcting those deeply inherited errors.
Because Vesalius actually looked at the human blueprint itself rather than, just using a primate proxy.
Right. But, even with Vesalius correcting the record and modern anatomy mapping everything out, it turns out that tidy mathematical rule I mentioned earlier, the 80 bone count,
Yeah.
it's actually a bit of a convenient lie, or at least an oversimplification.
Of course it is. Biology is never that clean. Right. Textbooks love round numbers, but biological reality is always a bit messier. Take the hyoid bone, for example, which is included in that 80 bone count.
Okay, where is that one?
It sits right in the front of your neck. And it's entirely unique because it is the only bone in the entire human body that is suspended purely by muscles and ligaments.
Wait, really? It doesn't connect to anything?
It does not articulate, meaning it doesn't form a joint or physically touch any other bone in the skeleton.
So it's technically part of the core structure, but it's just sort of floating freely in the soft tissue?
Exactly. And then you also have the auditory ossicles, which are the 6 tiny bones hidden deep inside your middle ear that allow you to hear.
Oh, right, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup ones.
Yeah, those are officially categorized as part of the axial skeleton, but developmentally, they're a complete outlier. They actually originate from entirely different embryonic tissue than the rest of the skull during fetal development.
So even though we casually say the axis is made of 80 bones, the underlying biological reality of how those form is just way more complicated.
Far more complex, yeah.
Well, if the math and the embryonic origins of this structural core are messy, the actual real-world development of these bones over a human lifetime is even wilder.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you see that play out most dramatically at the very top of this axis, the skull, which is a structure we generally think of as this, single solid bowling ball of bone. But it's not one bone at all.
Not even close.
It's actually 22 separate bones.
Yeah.
Or 23 if you classify the jawbone as completely distinct, which I guess most modern anatomical frameworks do now.
Yeah, they do.
So we're basically walking around with a helmet made of 24 interlocking plates.
And the genius of that design is really most apparent when we look at infants. In a newborn baby, those 24 plates are nowhere near fused together.
Right.
They're connected by highly flexible fibrous joints known as fontanelles, or in everyday language, you just call them a baby's soft spots.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit because looking at the mechanics of this from a survival standpoint has always kind of baffled me.
How so?
Well, why on earth would a species evolve to be born with a soft, physically unprotected brain case? I mean, having a literal flexible gap in your armor right over your most vital, delicate organ. That seems like an incredibly dangerous evolutionary gamble.
It does, right? It seems entirely counterintuitive. You'd think the brain demands maximum protection from second one.
Exactly.
But the soft spots are actually the stroke of bioengineering brilliance.
Yeah.
They serve a critical dual purpose. First, they allow the skull to physically compress, mold, and even overlap slightly during a vaginal birth.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if an infant's skull were a solid, fully fused sphere of bone, successfully navigating the narrow birth canal would be virtually impossible.
So the helmet has to be able to fold in on itself just to get out into the world.
Precisely. And the second purpose is just as vital. Those fibrous gaps give the brain the physical room it absolutely needs to rapidly expand.
Because infant brains grow super fast, right?
Very fast. The human brain literally triples in size during the very first year of life.
Triples. Wow.
Yeah, so if the skull was a locked, rigid box from the moment of birth, the growing brain would hit a wall of bone. It would have nowhere to expand, which would halt neurological development entirely.
So the extreme physical vulnerability of an infant's head is the exact mechanical feature that allows for our massive human intelligence to develop in the first place.
That is a great way to put it, yeah. And, this isn't just an interesting bit of evolutionary trivia. It has immense everyday clinical application.
Like for doctors checking up on babies.
Exactly. Pediatricians actively use the timing of when those fontanelles eventually close and turn into bone as a primary developmental checkpoint.
Right, if they close too soon or too late.
Yeah, if those soft spots fuse too early or stay open too long, it serves as an immediate clinical red flag for underlying metabolic or developmental conditions.
And even long after those gaps have fused, they leave a permanent record, right? Like
Yeah.
in adults, those soft spots eventually knit together into these jagged, immovable seams.
The cranial sutures.
Right, cranial sutures. And forensic anthropologists can actually use the progressive, slow calcification of those very seams to accurately estimate a person's age at death just by examining skeletal remains.
It's incredible.
It's like the skull acts as a biological recording device of our own physical maturation.
It really does. But, relying on the skull as a recording device has also led people down some incredibly flawed paths. What's fascinating here is the history of a pseudoscience called phrenology,
Oh, man.
which gained massive popularity between 1796 and the early 1800s.
This was the theory developed by Franz Joseph Gall.
Yes. So Gall proposed this seemingly scientific but fundamentally flawed concept. He claimed that the external surface of the skull, like the literal bumps, dips, and contours you could feel by running your hands over someone's scalp,
Right.
that those directly mapped to the size and power of specific underlying organs of the brain.
So the logic was if you had a prominent bump on a specific part of your head, it meant you had extra brain tissue in that exact location. And he claimed those localized brain areas controlled specific traits, meaning a bump could supposedly tell you if someone was highly intelligent or prone to criminality or had a specific personality quirk.
Yeah, phrenologists would literally map a person's head, feeling for these ridges, and then consult charts to read their character.
And people bought into this.
Oh, it was taken incredibly seriously by large segments of the public and even some scientific communities at the time. But modern anatomical research completely dismantles this.
Because it's just not how bone and tissue work.
Right. Phrenology was built on a totally false premise regarding how the axial skeleton interacts with soft tissue. The external contour of the skull bone simply does not track or mirror the internal folding or the regional development of the brain cortex beneath it.
Because the bone is just bone. The thickness of the skull varies based on structural needs and genetics, completely independent of whatever the brain is doing underneath.
Precisely. Rigorous anatomical study in the late 19th century completely discredited the practice. Today, it stands as one of the ultimate textbook examples of pseudoscience.
And it has a pretty dark legacy, too, based on our notes.
It does. It carries a very dark historical legacy, as it was frequently manipulated to provide a supposedly scientific justification for racial and criminal stereotyping. It really serves as a stark reminder that while the skeletal axis holds profound truths about human development, projecting our own biases onto its structure can have devastating real-world consequences.
That's a really important point. So if the skull's ultimate structural destiny is to fuse into this solid, unmoving, armor-plated vault to protect the brain, then the structure right below it had to solve a completely opposite engineering problem.
Right, moving down the axis.
It has to protect the central nervous system, specifically the spinal cord, but if it fused into a solid pipe, we wouldn't be able to bend, twist, or walk.
Right, we need to talk about the spine, the vertebral column, the mechanical core of the chassis.
Right. We have 26 individual vertebrae in an adult.
Mm.
And I specify adult because we actually start out with about 33 individual vertebrae as an infant.
Yes, and over time, the bones at the very base, so the sacrum and the coccyx, they fuse together into solid blocks.
But looking at the remaining individual vertebrae, the structural engineering is just brilliant. Like, think about it. If you stacked 26 heavy bones in a perfectly straight vertical line like a pillar,
Right.
and then you jumped off a tall wall, the compressive shock wave traveling straight up that rigid rod would just shatter the bone.
Oh, the axial load would be disastrous. It would destroy the bones and severely damage the spinal cord housed inside them.
Which is why the spine isn't straight at all. It's shaped like an alternating S.
Mm.
When you look at biomechanics, that alternating curve mathematically multiplies the spine's resistance to buckling under severe force.
It acts quite literally like a coiled spring.
Yeah, distributing the load of our body weight and any external shock across a much wider physical area.
And, the developmental reality here is remarkable. We are not born with that spring mechanism in place.
Wait, infants don't have the S-curve?
They don't. A newborn baby's spine features a single continuous C-shaped curve.
Just one big C.
Just one big C. It's a primary curve retained from their curled-up fetal position in the womb. The secondary curves, which are the specific inward bends that create the functional S shape, those only form in direct response to gravity and muscular effort.
So the spine physically reshapes itself based on how the baby moves.
Yes. When an infant is around 3 to 4 months old and finally develops the strength to lift its head against gravity.
Right, tummy time.
Exactly. The pull of those neck muscles actively alters the bone growth, creating the cervical lordosis. That's the inward curve of the neck.
Okay.
And then later, between 12 and 18 months, when the toddler learns to stand upright and walk, the mechanics of bipedal posture force the lower back to develop the lumbar lordosis.
Lordosis meaning that specific inward swoop that counterbalances the outward curves of the chest and pelvis.
Exactly. The shock-absorbing spring of the human back is literally forged by the act of a human learning to walk upright against Earth's gravity.
That is wild, and it completely upends a massive misconception. Because you constantly hear people complain about back pain, claiming that the human back is terribly designed.
Oh, I hear it all the time.
Right. The common myth is that the S-curve is an evolutionary design flaw from when our ancestors decided to stand up on two legs. And that's why modern humans suffer from so many back issues.
It is an incredibly widespread myth, but anatomical science corrects this directly. The S-curve is not a design flaw. It is a vital, highly successful evolutionary adaptation for bipedal shock absorption.
It's the reason we can walk.
It's the exact feature that makes walking upright possible without constantly concussing our brains with every step. When people experience debilitating back pain, it usually stems from degenerative issues with the discs, or muscular imbalances from modern sedentary lifestyles, or carrying excess load.
So it's not the curve itself.
Rarely. The curve isn't the problem. The curve is the evolutionary solution.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's talk about those shock absorbers you just mentioned, the intervertebral discs.
Right.
Because these sit between almost every single bone in the spine. They're made of fibrocartilage, which is this tough, dense, highly fibrous tissue that's far stronger than the cartilage in your nose or ears.
Yeah, very tough stuff.
And they wrap around a specialized gel-like core. Our research highlights that throughout the day, the sheer compressive weight of gravity naturally squishes these discs down, like squeezing fluid out of them.
That's right.
But at night, when you lie flat and remove that gravitational load, they actively rehydrate and swell back up.
Which means the actual physical length of your vertebral column fluctuates over a 24-hour period.
Wait, if they rehydrate and expand without compressive weight, that means we must be measurably physically taller in the morning when we wake up than we are when we go to bed.
You are, usually by about a centimeter or two.
That is so cool.
And this mechanical quirk becomes extraordinary when we look at space travel.
Oh, right.
When astronauts live in the microgravity of space, there is absolutely no compressive gravitational load on their spine. Their intervertebral discs fully rehydrate and expand to their absolute maximum biological capacity.
So their central chassis literally elongates.
It does. Astronauts return to Earth noticeably taller for the first day or two until Earth's gravity compresses the spring back down to its normal operating height.
Wow.
But there is a sobering side to these spinal mechanics as well, particularly in the neck. Because the cervical spine is highly mobile, allowing us to look around, it is also highly vulnerable to certain types of force.
Which is why sports medicine takes this so seriously. Like the strict rules against spearing, which is tackling headfirst in American football or rugby. Those rules exist entirely to protect this specific section of the axial skeleton.
Yes, exactly. Spearing causes what is known as axial loading. It drives a massive, sudden force straight down the top of the head, vertically compressing the cervical vertebrae in a way the spring was absolutely not designed to handle.
Because it hits it straight on.
Right. It bypasses the shock-absorbing curves and can cause catastrophic, paralyzing injuries to the spinal cord. And even without acute trauma, the structural integrity of the spring changes as we age.
This brings us to osteoporosis, right?
Correct. In older populations, a severe loss of bone mineral density can lead to structural failures within the spine itself. The bones become so porous that the sheer everyday weight of gravity causes compression fractures in the vertebral bodies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the front of the vertebrae physically wedge and collapse. That wedging is a leading cause of the kyphotic, profoundly hunched posture we frequently observe in elderly individuals.
Okay, so the spine is holding us upright. It's acting as a dynamic shock absorber, but it's also serving as the central anchor point for the next major component of the axis.
Moving on to the ribs.
Right, this moves us from the body's central pillar to its most dynamic, constantly moving basket, the ribs and the sternum.
Often referred to clinically as the thoracic cage.
And right there, just using the word cage reveals the mental image almost everyone has. We picture this rigid, bony birdcage meant purely to act as an unyielding shield for the heart and lungs. Like, if you knock on your chest, it feels like a solid, impenetrable wall.
It certainly feels solid, but the concept of a rigid box is another major anatomical myth. The rib cage is, in reality, a highly compliant, actively moving mechanical structure.
So if it's not a rigid box, then it must be physically shifting when we breathe. Like, is the rib cage actually expanding?
It absolutely is. We tend to think that breathing is just the soft tissue of the lungs doing all the work, but lungs cannot inflate themselves.
Right, they're just sacs.
Exactly. You have 12 pairs of ribs, and woven between all of them are the intercostal muscles. When you take a breath in, those muscles contract and physically lift and rotate the bones of the rib cage. Anatomists describe this using two distinct mechanical motions, the bucket handle and the pump handle.
The bucket handle, how does that work?
Yeah. Well, imagine a curved metal handle resting flat against the side of a bucket. When you pull that handle up, it swings outward, away from the bucket, increasing the width of that space.
Okay, yeah, I can picture that.
Your lower ribs swing outward in exactly the same way, the bucket handle motion, which drastically widens the lateral diameter of your chest.
Pushing out to the sides.
Right. Meanwhile, your upper ribs push the sternum forward and upward, like pulling the handle on an old-fashioned water pump. That increases the front-to-back diameter.
Okay, so if the lower ribs are swinging out like bucket handles and the upper ones are pushing out like a pump, the entire volume of that bony basket is physically changing shape.
Precisely.
Meaning our lung capacity isn't just about lung health, it's reliant on bone flexibility.
Absolutely. Total lung capacity is heavily dependent on the physical compliance of the rib cage. If your ribs were fused into a truly rigid cage, you simply would not be able to draw a deep breath, regardless of how pristine your lung tissue was.
That is fascinating.
The skeletal structure is an actively moving, integral component of the breathing mechanism itself.
Okay, I have to point out a highly specific structural quirk here. We have 12 pairs of ribs. The top ones curve around and anchor securely to the sternum, the breastbone, at the front.
Right.
But the bottom two pairs, pairs 11 and 12, are famously called floating ribs. They attach to the spine in the back, but they don't attach to anything at all on the front. They just sort of terminate into the abdominal muscle wall.
They do, yeah.
That sounds terrifying. Isn't a floating piece of bone just a dangerous spike waiting to puncture a kidney or an intestine if you bend over too fast?
It definitely sounds like an engineering flaw when you describe it that way, but once again, it is a brilliant feature for a body that needs to move.
Oh, really?
Think about it. If all 12 pairs of ribs were firmly anchored to the sternum in the front, your torso would be incredibly stiff, like a barrel. You would lose almost all ability to twist or bend sideways.
Oh, I guess you wouldn't be able to rotate at all.
Right. The fact that those floating ribs lack an anterior attachment gives your lower abdomen the massive freedom of movement required for trunk rotation.
And it probably helps with breathing too, right?
Yeah.
Because the diaphragm sits right there.
Exactly. It accommodates the massive downward excursion of the diaphragm, which is your primary breathing muscle when you take a very deep breath. Those unattached ribs basically get out of the way so you can breathe deeply and twist your torso simultaneously.
Okay, so the floating ribs are definitely a feature, not a bug. But speaking of bugs in the genetic code, there is a fascinating clinical reality regarding anatomical variation. Because it turns out we do not all possess exactly 12 perfect pairs of ribs.
We certainly do not. If we connect this to the bigger picture of how human development works, we have to examine the phenomenon of the cervical rib.
The cervical rib.
Roughly 0.5 to 1% of the entire human population develops a fully formed extra rib on their 7th cervical vertebra.
Literally a rib growing out of their neck.
A neck rib. It is a widely recognized, naturally occurring anatomical anomaly. Now, for many people, it causes absolutely no physical issues.
They might not even know they have it.
Exactly. But for others, the presence of that extra bone in the cramped space of the lower neck can compress major blood vessels or nerves running down into the shoulder, causing a painful condition known as thoracic outlet syndrome.
Ouch.
Yeah. But what makes the cervical rib so fascinating to science is what it reveals about our genetic programming.
This goes down to Hox genes, according to the notes.
Yes. Hox genes are essentially the master genetic switches that instruct the developing embryo on where to place different body parts along the central axis.
Okay.
They literally dictate the boundary of where the neck ends and where the rib-bearing thoracic spine begins.
So the cervical rib is really just a tiny glitch in that genetic boundary.
Precisely. Studying cervical ribs provides evolutionary and developmental biologists, the Evo-Devo field, with a live physical window into how skeletal identity is programmed.
Because just a tiny shift changes everything.
A minuscule shift in a Hox gene expression means a rib grows in the neck instead of the torso. It is concrete proof that human anatomy is not a fixed, factory-stamped template. It is a highly fluid spectrum of biological variation.
Which really brings our understanding of the chassis full circle. Because if there is one overarching theme this deep dive has revealed, it's that the axial skeleton is anything but a fixed, dead template.
Right.
I mean, we've traced how that 80-bone core is actually a shifting, fusing landscape from birth to death. We've seen how the skull begins as flexible plates to accommodate a tripling brain, a fact that ultimately exposes the rigid pseudoscience of phrenology for the fraud it was.
Absolutely.
And we've explored the biomechanics of the spine, realizing that its shock-absorbing S-curve spring is forged purely by a toddler's struggle against gravity. We've dismantled the myth of the rigid birdcage to reveal a moving, breathing basket of bone. And finally, we've seen how tiny genetic switches can casually add a rib to your neck, proving that anatomical normalcy is just a statistical average.
The axial skeleton is a living, constantly adapting physical timeline of a person's life. I mean, it traces the journey from infant soft spots to adult bone fusion and beyond.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means the bones aren't just the dead scaffolding holding up the story of you. The bones literally are the story. But before we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Right, because reviewing the realities of space travel raises a profound question about the future of human anatomy. We now know that our intervertebral discs physically alter and expand in microgravity.
Right.
And we know that the crucial shock-absorbing S-curve of the human spine is not innate at birth. It's forged entirely by an infant resisting Earth's gravity as they learn to lift their head and walk.
So if humanity ever successfully attempts multi-year generational missions to Mars,
Or if humans are eventually born and raised in zero-gravity environments, what happens to the highly specialized, gravity-dependent spring of the human spine?
that is the question. Will our evolutionary masterpiece of an axial skeleton fail to develop correctly? Like becoming a profound structural liability out in the stars.
It's a fascinating thing to think about.
It really is, and a great thought to leave you with. Next time you look at a plastic skeleton in a classroom, just remember it wasn't built to be a coat rack. It was built exclusively to fight Earth's gravity. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.